All right. Hi, my name is Megan, and I am a professor of anthropology at UNH. And Jerry Ann asked me to talk today and a little bit about the work I've been doing in this area. And I will say kind of black history is not my area of expertise. I'm an anthropological archaeologist who's worked for a long time on the pre-Columbian period for years and years. And now I've recently started a project right here in the Great Bay region looking at the early colonial period of contact between indigenous peoples and the British settler colonists that came to this area. So today I want to talk a little bit about trying to draw the connections between the territorial dispossession of indigenous lands here in this region, the rise of colonial wealth, which eventually led to the colonial wealth, colonial land wealth, and then the ability for the wealthiest colonial landowners to become slave owners right here in the Great Bay region. So that's the trajectory I want to take us on and kind of talk about how land is at the center of this arc. So project more? Okay. I'm not, geez, no one ever says I don't project enough. So at the core of the European and then Euro-American geographic conquest of North America was a process of dispossession. So I use that big fancy word, but it involved several key components. Physical acts of expropriation of indigenous lands, but also the construction and naturalization of particular cultural concepts. First off, they had to create the concept during the colonial period of the concept of land as property that could be expropriated, taken, and sold in the first place. The construct that indigenous peoples were savages needing to be civilized, and then the construct of colonial political legitimacy, and I want to really emphasize here legality. This concept of that the land transactions of the colonial period are legal, and we'll talk about that more. But these were all kind of things that were created. They were not innate when Europeans show up on our shores. They created this concept that land is property that could be expropriated from Indians, that there was a legal process that was fair and balanced, and that Indians were savages who hadn't developed the land, therefore taking the land was an appropriate process. That's what kind of the territorial dispossession I'm talking about. That's the concept. So you can go to the next. I want to explore this process that played out across our continent, across our country, and kind of continues to play out of the expropriation of indigenous lands and resources. But I want to talk about the case of right here in our backyard, the kind of what happened in the Great Bay estuary and the seacoast area of New Hampshire, and explore this process in the early colonial period. So from like the early 1600s through about the mid 1700s, mid to late 1700s, before the US Revolution, right? This is the colonial period where the British settlers come here and start colonizing the land. And this, I want to talk about kind of with one case study to illustrate this kind of complicated historical arc from the dispossession of Indian land that led to intergenerational colonial settler wealth that could be passed down, right? That's so important, this intergenerational wealth. And then that led to slave owning, the dispossession then of African people's labor, right? So the land dispossession leads to the dispossession of labor of black people. Does that make sense? That's the arc I'm going to try to show. So the Great Bay estuary here, what and who was the colonial period in the Great Bay estuary, just briefly. Native peoples had lived and occupied this region for millennia. We know there's early sites from the Paleolithic period as old as 10,000 years old in the Great Bay estuary. But the British started arriving kind of en masse and settling this area in the early 1600s. We know, Jerry and I have been talking about the Discover Portsmouth, 400 years of Portsmouth history, 1623, right? Huh? Yeah. So that's the beginning of the kind of colonial era here in the Great Bay region. Now, unlike Boston, the people coming here weren't Puritans. They weren't coming to the New World for this kind of Puritan religious ideology. They were here for one reason only, and that was wealth. Commodification of the natural resources and extraction of resources. These were a lot of rogue, actually Richard Waldron, he's kind of infamous, calls them, I have a lot of rogue indolence that I have to deal with. Because this was an area where the settlers coming were not Puritans. They were often outcasts from the religion. They were Quakers, who at the time were quite scandalous to the Puritans in Boston. And they were a lot of second and third sons from England who couldn't inherit land in England, so they came here to get land. And there was a lot of Scot indentured servants who end up becoming landowners. They come over from the, and they earn when they earn their freedom, they're given land. Of course, this is indigenous land, as we'll talk about.
Yep.
So this area was kind of, had a lot of rogue dudes, I like to call them when I give this talk. This was not your average colonial British Puritan Boston, right? This was the frontier zone too, if you go to the next slide. This was really a frontier zone between the British Empire and the French Empire. And we don't think we live in the frontier today or the kind of Wild West, but in the 1600s, this was really, really a wild area and kind of an unknown and largely unexplored area by the British. And it was kind of in the zone the French were, this is kind of where the French and British tensions fighting for power kind of meet in this area. And you can kind of see this is a great map from the 1600s. You can see that kind of once you leave the Great Bay watershed, right here's the Piscataqua and the watershed, it's like unknown. They don't know what lies ahead. It's kind of the wildlands, and that's where the French Empire, of course, is to that direction. So, and of course, in addition to all the settlers that are here, the indigenous peoples are here as well in this early period. So it's a very kind of dynamic time. When the I should just note too, this is a great map. It's for a historic resource map. It's quite accurate, but it was actually made, you might think, to document houses, but not at all. It was actually made by, to document mills. So the real industry here becomes milling and masting and rapid deforestation of what were largely pristine lands at this time. And the rivers start filling with sawmills and the fish start suffering, right? So there's a rapid market-based commodification of the resources here by the British settlers, which contrasts, right, greatly with the indigenous people's kind of understanding of the natural world and their kind of sustainable and reciprocal relationship with the natural world. These things come into conflict in the 1600s. But it's not conflict at first. You have, from about the 1620s through the 1650s and 60s, there's not a lot of overt violence anyways in this region. And then everything starts to really crack at King Philip's War in 1675. That's a southern New England war largely, but people think of that, but it actually ripples north. This was really the northern frontier where that war played out. And there's two great new books. So I think I sent them, and I don't know if you have them, but about King Philip's War. They're rewriting the history of that war. Lisa Brooks wrote My Beloved Kin, that just came out, and then Christina DeLucia wrote Memory Lands. So I highly recommend them. They're really rewriting and decolonizing King Philip's War's history. They're fabulous pieces of scholarship. So anyways, King Philip's War ripples north. You start seeing kind of indigenous peoples realizing that their fishing grounds, the falls, right, that they use for fish, those are where all the mills are placed. They start to realize they're getting a, raw deal, right? Like that this is not what they signed up for. As the violence starts rippling north, you start seeing increasing hostility and attacks, and it's about at that time in the 1670s that people here start moving, increasingly developing garrisons in their settlements. So, and these garrisons aren't really like big forts like you might think of. They don't have palisades, but essentially soldiers will come from Britain when things are tense. They'll send word to Boston and they'll send up some British soldiers, and the soldiers will typically go to the biggest house in the block, and then everybody would seek safety there. They're not necessarily even fortified. They're just kind of the biggest house in the area was called a garrison. So these are just wood structures, kind of very simple structures. They're not, people tend to think garrisons like big forts. This is not what we're talking about. But people start seeking shelter and kind of moving their properties, moving their houses into places that are more defensible, right, in the 1670s, and building these garrison houses. And if you go to the next slide. My work has been chasing down these garrison houses. I've been working for the last three summers. We've been searching for these early garrisoned settlements, houses in the Oyster River region. And my project's a community engaged project, and it's so it's volunteers and UNH students and volunteers. I have flyers if anyone's interested. I take volunteers on my project, so that's our season laid out at one of these garrisons. So I partner with the state volunteer archaeology program to get this work done. So we've been looking on the Oyster River up and down the Oyster River for these garrisoned early colonial settlement houses. And just briefly, this is You can go to the next one. We're doing archaeological survey. We lay out transects. You can go to the next one. And we shovel test. These houses aren't standing anymore. They're not extant, so we have to survey and look for them. It's a lot of physical labor. So we go out, we dig shovel test pits. We often find absolutely nothing, so we keep going. We sometimes use some fancier equipment like ground penetrating radar. And really fancy equipment. This is a hyperspectral drone, and that's a topic for another talk, but yeah. You can go. And I just want to note, and they're here, we work with, yeah, this is a great picture of Paul. The project's done, this is for years I worked on Native American pre-contact sites and indigenous, now I'm working on colonial sites, and a lot of my indigenous counterparts in the world say, finally you're working on white people's stuff, instead of always digging up our stuff. So, but this is a moment where the contact is so important to indigenous peoples and the British settlers that I work in partnership, and the Cowasac Band of the Abenaki, Pennacook Abenaki peoples are my tribal partners. Visit the site, this is at the Colonial Garrison site, but we were down there, Paul, looking for maybe evidence of smoking or fire from indigenous occupation. So this is in collaboration. So we looked and looked and looked for several of these garrisons, and we finally got lucky and found one that's intact. Very well preserved, and it's the Burnham Garrison, and this is the case I want to just talk us through now. It's it was one of the larger settlements, pretty far up on the Oyster River of these garrison houses. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, it's actually this large house, so it was one of the larger garrison houses. And here's what, it has 3 visible foundations today. Here's what I've determined to be the house. Then there's an outbuilding, and there's a barn. But let me tell you a little bit about Burnham. So, Robert Burnham, so this property, this property is on a creek that flows into the Oyster River. We haven't yet found evidence of indigenous pre-contact occupation, but I'm certain it's there. We just haven't done a lot of looking for that. We focused on the garrison. It's in a prime kind of resource zone, and it's up on this kind of craggly hill, this very steep hill. They build their in a kind of defensible position. And the first owner of the property is a guy named Ambrose Gibbons, who's extremely wealthy, and he acquires this property in the 1640s. We don't know exactly when, but then he builds a house, and he dies, and he gives it to Henry Sherburne, who actually lived in Portsmouth, his son-in-law, because he only had a daughter, and of course at this time women could not own land. That's a whole other piece of the land puzzle, right? So, and then Sherburne never lives in it, and he sells it to Robert Burnham, who is a British settler. And if you go to the next thing, and this is the deed that gives the land to Robert Burnham. So he sells it to him for £100, and I did a little math on the online converter. It's 200 acres of land on the Oyster River in Durham, and if you know Durham, that's a very affluent area. Today, that value would be $22,000. So land is being sold for like nothing. We are talking like nothing. This is cheap at the time. Land is being expropriated and then bound up in these legalese speaks, right? These deeds that makes everything look like a very fair transaction in this legalese speak. And at this time, indigenous peoples are signing treaties, signing deeds, giving deeds away to settlers. They don't speak the language, right? So, but it all then looks legal and very like prescribed and kind of appropriate. And this is just an example, it's in Old English, of the deeds. And I have a historian on the project, Diane Fisk, who's amazing, who goes and hunts through all the deeds to figure out the descent of our properties. And I just want to say kind of there's a great quote from another fabulous book called Firsting and Lasting, Writing Indians Out of Existence in New England. And she says, the construction of an origin myth that assigns primacy to non-Indians who settled the region in a benign process involving righteous relations with Indians and just property transactions that lead to an inevitable and lamentable Indian extinction. That's like the process, right, of this. And it's that benign process and legality that's a big part of territorial dispossession that looks so legal, and they just pass the land down. So that's... you can go to the next one. But we excavated this site. We found the Burnham Garrison. We found with community volunteers. This is where we'll work this summer. some of our excavations. We found a hidden foundation that's probably Ambrose Gibbons, the earlier occupation. And you see right away, this is a piece of Westerwald. This is a trade ware from Germany of the time, of the 1600s. So here you have people living on a craggy rock in this frontier zone, and they have wealth. They're part of the Atlantic trade system, and they're getting very nice items in their house. They're a very wealthy family out in this kind of boony place, right? There's wealth evidence in their material culture. The Burnhams have a lot of wealth. The archaeology shows they have a lot of wealth in the 1660s through the 1700s when they're living at this site. So if you go to the next one, why did I put this back in here? Go to the next one. Well then, so Robert Burnham owns the property. He then gives it to one of his sons. He gives it to his son Jeremiah Burnham. He has a lot of sons, and so at the time of the infamous Oyster River Massacre, so things are going south after the 1670s in terms of relationships between settlers and indigenous peoples, but they take a real turn to the worse after the Treaty of Pemaquid of 1693, which ends what they call King William's War, the Second Indian War, the northern version of kind of King Philip's War that started in 1688. The British get 13 kind of disaffected tribal leaders to sign a treaty that's very, very friendly to the British and very unfriendly to the indigenous peoples. It's not, so it's how this always goes down. And in retaliation, the French also are like, this is not good for the French Empire to have lost so much land in this war. So the French arm a group of Indians. It's kind of a complicated story beyond the realm of the time we have here, but they lead a raid or an attack or what's infamously known as the massacre, right? Because when you label wars, you can assign them a name, and that gives a certain image of what happened in them. But an indigenous, armed by the French, they come to Oyster River in 1694, July 1694, and they burn garrisons up and down the Oyster River. They kill 100 people. They take 27 captives. And the south shore, if you go back, actually, that's why I had that in there. The south shore of Oyster River is decimated compared to the north shore. And the Burnham garrison survives this attack. Now, they kill 100 people. Oyster River's population was British population was 300. So they kill a third of the population. So it's a devastating kind of attack. It's very, successful kind of attack in retaliation for the Treaty of Pemaquid. The majority of these garrisons are burned. Whole families are wiped out. But the Burnham garrison survives. It's one of the only surviving garrisons on the side of the river. And the oral history of the survival of the Burnham family is that somebody was awake with a toothache and they heard the first shot, and so they ran down and closed the gate. And that's why the Burnham family survived. And it's just that's the story. He had a toothache, and that's, these narratives that get passed down, right? But there's also the narrative that, so when they closed the gate, there was a group of 10 Indians, the oral history is, sleeping next to the Burnham garrison, and they shot up and heard the gate and they didn't run just over a small gate and kill the Burnham family. No, they ran to their neighbor and killed their neighbor, so they left the Burnham family alone. If you start to deconstruct this a little bit too, they were comfortable enough to sleep next to the Burnham garrison. And so it's kind of these pieces of this written history don't start to make sense, and that's where archaeology can start to relay. If you go next. And in this hearth, if you go back, this is their central hearth of the Burnham family. This is the fallen chimney. This is a packed hearth. And in their hearth, I have found several remnants of indigenous artifacts. So they had indigenous artifacts in their central hearth, in their house before the attack. And we have found a higher density of indigenous artifacts at this site than any other colonial site in the region that's ever been dug. We have a consistent presence of native artifacts. So I would suggest that the story that's been passed down is pretty erroneous, and Paul Denise and I talked about this a lot when they visited, that the reality is they were probably spared because they had a relationship with indigenous peoples. So in this odd way, they had some extant relationship with indigenous peoples. They survived the massacre, and what happens when 100 of your neighbors die? Their land becomes available, and they become massive landowners. I'm talking massive landowners. The Burnhams become extremely wealthy, and they pass Jeremiah, moves off the rock in the early 1700s when things seem to be calming down. and he moves and builds down on better land. He dies a very wealthy landowner, but not a slave owner in 1718. We know that because this is his probate record. We find though that his will had enough money. They paid they paid one of their neighbor's slaves to bury Jeremiah Burnham. Jeremiah gives his land to his sons and Jeremiah Jr. That's right. The other part of working on this early colonial period, they name each other all the same things. So it's very challenging to figure it all out. Jeremiah names Jeremiah, names Jeremiah. So Jeremiah Jr., we can say, even though they didn't go by that, but Jeremiah Jr., so Jeremiah, Robert to Jeremiah Jr., so Jeremiah, the middle one, he dies, a slave buries him, but he's not a slave owner. He pays to have him buried. But his son becomes a very large slave owner. After they have the land wealth, they're able to become his son, right? And that's what I want to also talk about, that intergenerational accumulation of wealth, and they're able to pass it down. It's so important to sustaining wealth. And his son, Jeremiah Jr., becomes a slave owner. It's recorded that he had the marriage of Belmont and Venus in January 1760. Their surname was Barhue, and they're said to have been brought from Africa and belonged to Jeremiah Burnham. And Venus, the wife, the matriarch of the family, dies in 1783. We know that's when she's buried. They live on the Burnham farm on a point called N-Word Point. That's actually what it was called on Oyster River. And they had 7 children. And those 7 children were variously sold into slavery. I don't know if Anon at 4 was bought for $100 by a neighbor. Cesar became the property of Val Leathers of Nottingham, and he ended his days free, still living with the owner's daughter, still in servitude. Titus was bought by Colonel James Gilmore, who lived in Durham. Jubal was acquired by Captain Smith Emerson of Durham. And Peter, he remained in possession of Jeremiah Burnham along with his parents, and he was referred to as cross-grained and required much skill in management. And his sleeping place was called Pete's Hole, which they say you can still see in the old Burnham Mansion, which is another site that's on the other side of the river from where Jeremiah lived. So I tried to do a little research on the Barhue family. If anyone's heard that surname, I did a quick Google search and I couldn't find anything about descendants that might still be in the region, but I would love any insight. Barhue, B-A-R-H-E-W. They were freed, eventually freed in the 1760s, but there were 70 recorded slaves in the 1708, I want to say, in New Hampshire. And Jeremiah Burnham is later in the 1760s owns 8 slaves, right? He's a pretty big proportionately slave owner. We're talking about a lot of wealth. And that all comes from that indigenous land wealth, the intergenerational wealth, the legality of the whole process. So my work this is a picture looking out onto the Great Bay from the mouth. This is the mouth of the Oyster River. And kind of, there's a lot of history that we don't know right here in our backyard. And I think kind of some dark history. And hopefully doing more archaeology, working collaboratively and together and open with community members, we can start to shed more light on this history. So that's my talk. So thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Yeah, my name is Willard Let, and I want to thank Megan for her really scholarly presentation. She really kind of laid things out, and I'll pretty much start off where she left off. She dealt with the 1600s, 1700s. I'll start in the 1800s.
Yeah.
But before I start, or with my start, I'm going to start with the poem. It was written by a young man named Gil Scott Heron. It's called Jose Campos. I have said I wasn't going to write no more poems like this. I had confessed to myself all along, tracer of life, poetry trends, that awareness, consciousness, poems that screamed of pain and the origins of pain and death had blanketed my tablets. And therefore, my friends, brothers, sisters, in-laws, outlaws, and besides, they already knew but Brother Torres, common ancient bloodline, Brother Torres is dead. I had said I wasn't going to write no more poems like this. I had said I wasn't going to write no more words down about people kicking us when we're down, about racist dogs that attack us and drive us down, drag us down, and beat us down. But the dogs are in the street. The dogs are alive, and the terror in our heart has scarcely diminished. It has scarcely brought us the comfort we suspected. The recognition of our terror and the screaming release of that recognition has not removed the certainty of that knowledge. How could it? The dogs, rabid, foaming with the energy of their brutish ignorance, stride the city streets like robot gunslingers and spread death as night lamps flash crude reflections from gun butts and police shields. I had said I wasn't going to write no more poems like this, but the battlefield has oozed away from the stilted debates of semantics, beyond the questionable flexibility of primal screaming. The reality of our city, jungle streets and their Gestapos, has become an attack on home, life, family, and philosophy. I had said I wasn't going to write no more poems like this, but dogs are in the street. It's a turnaround world where things are all too quickly turned around. It was turned around so that right looked wrong. It was turned around so that up looked down. It was turned around so that those who marched in the streets with Bibles and signs of peace became enemies of the state and risk to national security, so that those who questioned the operations of those in authority on principle of justice, liberty, and equality became the vanguard of a communist attack. It became so you couldn't call a spade a spade. Brother Torres is dead. The Wilmington 10 are still incarcerated. Ed Davis, Ronald Reagan, James Hunt, and Frank Rizzo are still alive, and the dogs are in the street. I had said I wasn't going to write no more poems like this. I made a mistake. It's Jose Campos Torres. It was actually a song that Gil Scott-Heron wrote and performed on one of his albums back in the 1970s. And as I was preparing for today's presentation, you know, I was overcome with a great sadness because too many times, you know, I've found myself doing this kind of presentation. There's an African philosopher, Amilcar Cabral, who said, we don't struggle for ideas or thoughts in people's head. We struggle for material benefit and a higher level of human existence. And too many times, it feels like the people who come to these kind of activities are coming because they want to hear some new ideas or, you know, have this thought like, oh yeah, I understand, you know, I identify with that. And it doesn't result in material benefit or a higher level of human existence. So the title of today's event is Land, Wealth, and Policies of Marginalization. I will be starting off in a place very similar to where Megan started. You know, and Megan, as I look at the title, Megan started her presentation and focused on the beginning of the title, which is land. In my presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the end of the presentation, which is marginalization. Next slide. With this presentation, talking about the experience of African people in American society, starts with the Africans who were dispossessed in their homeland, who were dislocated from their homeland, and as part of the process, also dehumanized. the process of the transatlantic African chattel enslavement system had some unique features that a lot of people, even today, don't really seem to be aware of. Because when you talk about the African experience, sometimes you have people who will say like, oh, well, this slavery thing, even Megan talked about, some of the Native Americans were enslaved, and, it's in the Bible, and it's always been, a social practice, and there was even slavery in Africa. But one of the unique things about the experience of the transatlantic chattel enslavement system was the dehumanization of the, next slide, the dehumanization of the people who were engaged and caught up in that process. This whole, and it resulted in a general dehumanization of the African personality and the European imagination. And that process resulted in, or served as a justification that allowed the rationalization of several other processes. Next slide. So those Africans who were caught up in the African chattel enslavement system were denied their human rights. They were not considered fully human. Because one of the, if you remember when we were, as Megan was talking about the 1700s, there was this event or a series of events called the American Revolution that occurred. And one of the well-known theoreticians of that period, who I believe in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, wrote about unalienable rights that everyone has, that, that everyone was endowed with. And Thomas Jefferson, we're here in South Church, he was a Unitarian, but he was also an enslaver. And he was able to hold these high ideals while enslaving African people because of the dehumanization of the African personality and the European imagination. They were imagined to actually not be fully human. They were also, and as part of that process, they were denied social rights, personal social rights. So the Africans caught up in the African chattel enslavement system, they couldn't marry. They weren't considered eligible to have human relations. They couldn't, Megan mentioned that the family ties between parents and children were not respected. They were imagined to not even exist. And finally, because of this whole marginalization that resulted from the dehumanization of the African personality and the European imagination, they also had no property rights. So, next slide. So along comes the Civil War and the 13th Amendment at the end of the Civil War, and African chattel enslavement ended. And then, but before the Civil War happened, there was, as the country was trying to figure out, well, how are we gonna, what are we gonna do? How are we gonna be the United States of America? There were some parts of the country and some people who said, well, the slavery thing, it shouldn't happen. And others said, well, it is happening. It's going to happen. We want it to happen. And there were laws that were put into place that said, well, if you were born in this state, because this state legislature had put into place laws that legalized slavery, if you were an African person born in this state, you were subject to be enslaved. But if you were born in a state where slavery was not legalized, then you could be free. And there were even some states where Philadelphia was one. The first capital of the U.S. was in Philadelphia. And I know some of the people here in Portsmouth are familiar with the story because George Washington, another, highly respected scion of the American experience, he was also an enslaver. And Philadelphia, Pennsylvania and Philadelphia had a policy where if an enslaved, they'd say, well, we believe in freedom. And if a person who's enslaved stay here 6 months, they're automatically freed. And on a judge, and you probably heard the story, came out of that process. Well, there was an enslaved African, Dred Scott, who had moved with his enslaver to Illinois, and he had petitioned for his freedom. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1857. And the Supreme Court ruled that African people weren't citizens, and they had no, and the famous quote is that they had no rights that a white person was bound to respect. So that was in 1857. 1865, 1863 to 65, the Civil War. After the Civil War ended, there was something that they called the Reconstruction period, where they were attempting to reconstruct the United States with this new class of citizens. And in 1875, they passed the Civil Rights Act. And the Civil Rights Act of 1875 said that it was against the law to discriminate against someone based on their race. It was illegal. And so the civil rights cases of 1883 that went to the Supreme Court was a case brought by a private citizen who said, why can't we do what we want to do with our private property? And so the Supreme Court ruled that the provision of the Civil Rights Act that applied to private citizens was unconstitutional. And then in 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case was a Supreme Court case that was brought in Louisiana against the government because there was this policy of they called it segregation, where African people and people of European descent were required to be in separate, in this particular case, separate train cars. And the Supreme Court ruled in 1896 that the civil rights case, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 that prohibited the government from discriminating against people based on race was also unconstitutional. And that began and they articulated a doctrine called separate but equal. So it's like, oh yeah, no, you can't, you can't do that. So all these things, this is a steady, a clear line of social practice, social theory that reinforced and upheld the dehumanization of the African personality in the European imagination. And that marginalization of the identity of African people as fully human then was a significant factor in the policies related to land and wealth. So this takes us to the, I'll say the early 1900s. And after this series of legal cases, well, not after, the legal cases and the decisions of the Supreme Court was aligned with the social philosophy of the day. And African people suffered a series of marginalization measures and efforts that were fairly horrific. One, when, you probably heard the term the criminal justice system. Well, for African people, it was a criminal punishment system because the system wasn't designed initially for justice for African people. It was designed to punish them. It wasn't designed to serve and protect. It was designed to command and control. And so this legal posture continued, and even in the political arena, African people were disenfranchised through practices like and organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. There was a social tradition and policy of extrajudicial killings that we call lynching that were fairly commonplace. And in fact, it was so commonplace that there's a what do you call it? A narrative going around that says that even the term picnic is connected to and derived from the practice of lynching, because lynchings were social events. People would come out and, you know, and then finally, or maybe I should say additionally, there was a practice and a system of kleptocracy where no economic resources or assets of African people were safe. You know, you could just about in any way take through coercion, through you know, direct assault, just about anything that you wanted to or desired when it came to African people. So we see that by looking at the U.S. Census records, that in the 1920s, 41 million acres of land, farmland, was under ownership of African people. By 2010, it was less than 4 million. And part of what contributed to this great land dispossession was, some of it was those earlier social factors that I had talked about, the political, social, and economic factors of lynching, Ku Klux Klan, and other kind of social realities, led to something called the Great Migration, where many people of African descent left the South, and they left their land. And that resulted sometimes in a process that even today results in land loss called partitioning, where if you own land and you die without a will, then your land goes to your children. And if one of the children decides they want to sell their interest, then you got to divide the land up. And that's been a major cause of land loss. But also there were things like government policies where the policies that were designed to support farmers were not enjoyed by people of African descent. So we'll go to the 30s. And many of you have heard about what happened back in the 1930s called the Great Depression. There were a number of different programs put in place to ameliorate the economic difficulties that resulted from the Great Depression. One thing that was done was one major change was in making home ownership available and affordable by bringing the practice of the 20-year mortgage, where you didn't have to, at one time, if you wanted to buy a house, you had to bring, just like if you wanted to buy a house, you had to do the same thing you do when you go to the store to buy a loaf of bread. You bring all the money and you pay for it and you get it. But after the Depression, they came up with this process of home mortgaging. The National Housing Act of 1934 created that opportunity. The Federal Housing Administration was formed, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Home Loan Bank Board asked the Homeowners Loan Corporation to come up with some guidelines for how we can exercise proper stewardship and responsible lending for home ownership. So they came up with a system where they had 4 types of real estate. Type A, which was color-coded green, was the desirable, the good stuff, the high-quality real estate. Probably houses over in the Oyster River area that we were talking about, you know. Type B was color-coded blue. It was still desirable, but it wasn't like, you know, top quality. Type C was color-coded yellow, and that said that, oh, well, the area was starting to be a little bit down on its luck. And finally, type D was color-coded red, and it was considered undesirable. And one of the things that made, or that one of the factors, one of the characteristics that justified a type D rating was the presence of African people living in the community. And this resulted, and so it had this synergistic effect where the government had decided that, and I have to thank my friend, Professor Ted Wilkinson, who kind of talk me through some of this. So the government had this policy of rating these the neighborhoods, and the insurance company said, well, if this is what the government thinks, then we're going to use this in terms of how we insure stuff, because this is, you know, then the banks, they ended up saying, well, you know, if the insurance company doesn't want to insure the communities, then we're not going to make loans. And we see this evolve until in the 1970s, there were certain areas where that were considered undesirable. They just put a line around them in red. And that's hence the term redlining. Yeah. And so, you know, even back, you know, 40, 50 years ago, there used to be a term that people would use called, for inner city communities, called ghettos. And, you know, in the American experience, ghettos often translated into inner city communities that were occupied by people of African descent. And we see in the, probably, I guess, maybe in the 70s into the 80s, this process of people of European descent moving back into cities, and we called it gentrification. You know, and one of the challenges with that is that it's difficult to make sense out of nonsense. And one of the things that, you know, one of the basis for this, or one of the weapons, one of the methods that was used to operationalize the dehumanization of the African personality in the European imagination was creating a hierarchy of the human family and categorizing us, the humans by the presence of melanin in their skin. And if you were melanin deficient, you were considered white, and you're at the top of the scale for the human family. And if you were melanin enhanced, you were considered black, and you were at the bottom. And so these terms, you know, that are associated with this concept of race, black and white, became shorthand. You know, so, and it made it difficult, oftentimes, for people to understand how, you know, what's attributable to people and what's attributable to policy. The whole process that I'm calling ghettoization was really a process of disinvestment. We talked about how the communities were coded based on, you know, characteristics, one being the presence of people of African descent. And so when people of African descent moved into a community, there was not only was there no more investment coming in, but much of the investment that was there was taken out. And that resulted in a deterioration of the communities because they didn't have resources. And when we talk about this concept called gentrification, we're really talking about reinvestment, you know, because when, even today, when we see people of European descent moving into these communities, then they have access to resources. Those resources, you know, and are reinvested in that community. The community blooms and blossoms. In fact, this is a short, I only got a few minutes, so, but I want to say that an example of this, clear example, is an experience that happened in Chicago, where there was a community called South Shore. And African Americans started moving into that community, and people of European descent started moving out. There was a local bank. The bank said, we're going to close, you know, we're leaving. A group of churches and nonprofits bought the bank. And they started to give loans to the families moving in. And South Shore Bank was considered a miracle worker. They even formed a consulting organization called Shore Bank that went around the country because people were wondering, well, you know, what did you guys do? What's the magic? How did you like keep these communities from falling apart? And part of the challenge is that we end up focusing on people and not the policies. Next slide. So this takes us to the 40s, where after World War II, there was the GI Bill. And the GI Bill provided, resources for returning soldiers, for education, and also the GI home loan guarantee. However, by and large, the GI Bill, the benefits of the GI Bill were not extended to veterans of African descent. Also, one of the things that, a couple of things that happened was with land and home ownership, with private covenants, the creation of the suburbs, the practice of block busting, and contract buying. All of those things sort of swirled together where homeowners were able to put a covenant or a legal rider in their deeds that says that this property can't be sold to a person of African descent. And also, as the miracle of the industrialization of America that resulted from World War II continued and the suburbs were being built, then people of European descent were able to move out into these newly constructed homes. And there was a insidious practice called block busting, where a real estate agent would work to buy a home and then sell it to a person of African descent. And their neighbors, the other homeowners, European descent, would rush to leave before their home was downgraded so they could get, the best deal that they could. So they would buy the home. They would buy homes from these residents fleeing to the suburbs generally, and they would buy the home cheap, and then they would sell them at a elevated price to African American families. And that meant that oftentimes the properties that they would that the African Americans would buy would be older housing stock, and they did not have, because of disinvestment, they weren't provided the resources to maintain the homes. And there was another practice called contract buying, where if you did not have the resources to get a loan, or you didn't have access to loans from the banks, again, the redlining stuff, then you could buy on contract, which is sort of like rent to own, they call it. But the practice was that if you missed one payment, you could be thrown out. So there was no equity involved in that. It's another marginalization policy that contributed to both, that impacted negatively both land ownership and wealth. Next slide. So we see again and again where the impact of policy decisions are characterized as outcomes of personal deficiencies. And, that's part of that marginalization, part of that dehumanization of the African personality in the European imagination. The response, by and large, by the European community is like, well, what do you expect? And one of the policies that adversely impacted home ownership was that in many places, cities and towns, there had been communities that had grown up and had begun functioning. So a couple of things happened. The U.S., I think it was Health, Education, and Welfare, U.S. United States government department, said, hey, you know what? We want to deal with slums and blight in the cities. Also, in the 50s, the decision to create the interstate highway system was used to remove or destroy many of the communities and what little home ownership and sense of community that people of African descent had in many communities. Next. So one of the things that happened, part of this whole process of attributing the impact of policy decisions as outcomes from personal deficiencies was this idea, that there were assumptions that we can make about why African people were marginalized when it comes to land or home ownership and wealth. And some of them were that like, well, you know, I mean, when it's part of the American zeitgeist of meritocracy and individual effort, you know, that if you work hard, you play fair, you get ahead, you're rewarded, you know. So if there's this differential, particularly in terms of asset ownership or wealth, then one factor is might be education. But Brandeis University did a study, and it's on the list of things called the discrepancy between asset ownership between people of European descent and African descent couldn't be explained by whether they attended college or not. Another factor that people think about is, well, you know, I mean, we hear all about these, single parent homes, and surely, you know, that has something to do with the person's ability to make it in the world. And when there was, and in their research, they found that having a two-parent household did not address this or relieve this disparity. You know, income. You know, maybe people are, you gain more assets because you're working harder, you got a higher paying job, or maybe you're working full time and the other people are part time. But even income, when employment, when Brandeis University looked at it, they found out that wasn't explanatory. And finally, you know, something that I'm sure that we've all told our children about how important it is to save, and, you know, delayed fulfillment, and, you know, that kind of stuff. So consumption patterns were considered maybe a factor in this discrepancy. And again, Brandeis University, in their study, The Asset Value of Whiteness, found out that wasn't the case. Next slide. The Brookings Institution looked at home ownership, which for most communities and most people, their largest asset, their most valuable asset is their home. And the Brookings Institution found that even with home ownership, that communities that are primarily African American, the property is valued at a lower value. Next slide. And part of what they said was that, you know, regardless of what the laws are, you know, we as people make certain we have these ideas, and we bring those ideas into the marketplace. So when we talk about what something is worth, it's not a objective assessment, it's a value judgment. And as long as this process of the dehumanization of the African personality and the European imagination is happening, then, you know, you just attribute less value. Next slide. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston just did a study recently that said that in the Boston area, the median income for white families was about $250,000. You know, we're rounding up a little bit, you know. And the black family median wealth was actually zero. We're rounding down a little, you know. And that is not, that's not like, you know, I mean, that was in Boston, but we see something similar as we look around the country. So that's, you know, that's the poem that I said I wasn't going to write anymore, you know. But so what do we do about it? You know, I mean, it's enough, you know, we don't want to be, what do you call it when you pass an accident on the highway and you kind of like slow down and look, and then just go on to grandmother's house or to the Thanksgiving dinner or wherever and put it out of your mind. You know, what can be done? If the discrepancy of marginalization that results in this unequal land and wealth distribution, what needs to happen? Well, you know, I think that we have to start at the beginning. And the beginning was this process of the dehumanization of the African personality in the European imagination. And in order to hold someone in a position, a degraded position as property. If you wanted to, I mean, if you did, you had to convince them as well as those around you that it was okay. And that created a number of injuries to individuals. So we gotta address those injuries, you know. But also we have to address the policies and the institutions that enable these outcomes. So it's not enough, and we're talking about repair. We're talking about repair of the human family. We're talking about reparations. But we're not talking about just remuneration. We're not talking about money. We're talking about humanity, you know. So I'll stop there, and I'll probably get a chance to say more through the questions.
I'd like to thank both of you for your presentation. Very interesting. Mr. Let, I really appreciate your comments at the beginning, where you talked about coming to gatherings like this and then wondering what was going to happen afterwards.
Knowing what's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, I want to address that. First of all, Harper's December 2018 addressed people like yourself and the burden that is on you having to keep constantly coming out to audiences like this. I highly recommend people reading that. Ideally, in the future, I'd like to see a white person deliver the same speech that you did here. So you can be concentrating, as the article said, more in assisting black people. So that was the gist of that article. The second thing that was more specific to what you just said, and that's Michael Eric Dyson's book, Tears We Cannot Shed. He lists 10 specific things at the end that white people can do, including the kinds of reparations that you were talking about. So I highly recommend that. And then finally, I just finished reading White Fragility, Why White People Have Difficulty Talking About Racism. This is written by a white sociologist. It's the book we've been waiting for. Michael Eric Dyson said, this is the one. Please read this. And so we can work together. So I work with the Seacoast Peace Academy, and we promote ongoing conversations on this and dialogue. Please watch for our publicity, so that we don't just have this event, that we can continue to have this discussion. Thank you.
First of all, you brilliantly outlined the pervasive network of a series of symptoms of an underlying cancer in my mind. That is, it's a global cancer, and it's something that I've seen, this kind of marginalization that you're talking about in different parts of the world, personally through travels and also by reading. On the east coast of Africa, for example, we had the same problems of marginalization when the Arabs came along East Africa, and the countries of the Swahili coast are having the same kind of conversation about how to get reparation from the Arab countries for stealing human resources and the wealth of that nation, of those nations, to return that back and to reinvest in their infrastructure because of that, taking advantage of those individuals. In Ireland, the same process occurred between the Protestants of Britain and the Irish, the Catholics. In America, the Trail of Tears, another kind of marginalization. I suppose what's happening with along the transatlantic trades, slave trade, all kinds of activities like this underlie a cancer which is, you can summarize as the inequality of the human races, which is a thesis put forth by one of those Africans who migrated into Europe by the name of Campos de Gobineau, and that's the name of his thesis. And that was a germ of an idea that was being entertained by a number of his peers, this inequality of the human races. From that, you can easily jump into the next phase, which is to marginalize people and to see them as subhuman or to put them in different categories. And so what is missing here is something simple in statement, but it's very profound, and that is the oneness of humankind. Once you accept that premise rather than the false premise of the inequality of the human races, then you begin to have something to work with on which to establish a set of policies to correct these numerous injustices. Until we develop that mentality of the oneness of humankind, we'll be shooting in the dark or just treating the symptoms but not getting to the cancer.
I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more. So you said that the property was purchased for, let's say, £100, right? Do we know who sold it first, like the first deal? Who was it made? Was it between natives and this individual or not? And also, and let me just finish this. And also, if you could speak a little bit so people understand that the assumptions that some native people had selling their land did not correspond to the cultural expectations of the white settlers.
Yeah, I have not gotten to the original deed. I'm looking for it, that 1640 deed. A lot of these deeds were signed with, like Sagamore Rawls, like these speakers for their tribes, with white settlers, like at South Berwick and Portsmouth. You see this over and over, but that was what I said, that the concept that land was property was not a indigenous concept. So when they agreed to sell their lands or sign these deeds that they couldn't even read because they didn't, they were translated for them, or like, they had no concept, and they especially thought the land to them was most important for its resources, and they always thought they would be able to return for the resources, for the fishing, for the hunting. And so it was when the mills start going up on their falls and their fishing that they realize that native people start to realize, oh, there is no more, the resources that. So the concept was, sure, you can, like, to them it was kind of at the beginning, like, this is, we'll let you live, like, like we live, we don't understand this, what you're asking, as long as we can come and get our fish and do our seasonal rotations and our movement, and get our harvest and live our life. Like, there's not a concept. It was a total exploitation of different worldviews, right, by the British settlers. And wrapped up in that point, I want to make that political legitimacy and legality, which so much of what you talked about is still the case, that it's all, well, there's a fair home loan system. We just rate them A to D. It's not, it's legal, it's fair. And that starts at the beginning of settler colonialism. And that is at the heart of our continued trajectory, right? Does that answer that? Yeah. So, yeah.
Back there.
Mr. Let,
Yes.
there is, you've spoken eloquently about this imbalance that's been set up. Has there been any move in any government anywhere, in the United States government, to address this legally in some way, to set up some kind of system for addressing the issue of reparations?
Yeah, I think that first I'll say no.
Yeah.
And then I will say that at the root of the challenge that we're facing is this dehumanization of the African personality in the European imagination. The preponderance of the scientific evidence and the consensus of the scientific community says that human behavior affects climate change. And we all agree and say, oh, well, we need to do, let's get some solar energy and buy a Prius. But at the same time, for at least since the 50s, the consensus of the scientific community and the preponderance of the scientific evidence, certainly since the decoding of the human genome, is that there's no such thing as race. But, you pick up a government form, and one of the things they demand you do is identify. And our friend Albert Einstein said, you can't solve a problem at the same level of thinking that created it. It's very similar to what our friend James Baldwin said back in 1968 when he at Berkeley, when he said, if you think you're white, you're irrelevant to this conversation, because that's the problem. It's not the solution to look for you to be charitable. It's not about charity, it's about justice. So, short answer, no.
Now I have to respond to that real quickly because I don't know if any of you saw, I believe it was a Smithsonian magazine that had on its cover two girls from the same family, young girl, kids. One was white looking, one was, and that whole article about Pantone colors inside was amazing.
National Geographic.
Oh, thank you, National Geographic, okay. And the point was, and my husband said, wouldn't it be neat if we could go away from that system that you're describing, describe what you are, to just put down your Pantone number And it's like there are a million Pantone numbers in terms of the color of your skin. From pasty white, down to very, very dark.
But even doing that is suggesting that there's some significance
To your,
to the amount of melanin you have in your
Yeah.
skin, and it's totally irrelevant.
All right, that was my raggedy point. Well, let me just say that would be a step in the right direction, but okay, you got me there. But the other thing that I got out of your talk was that you're talking about laws being created so that people could do what they want, like creating the idea of land as property. And you went right on from that, talking about how laws were created to disenfranchise black people, people of color, from having their property. And what I came around away thinking is that we really should always question every law. The laws that are being created in states or whatever, that are diminishing our quality of life as people, certainly in the case of minorities. We as white people, you're wondering what we can do. We can always look at the law that's being proposed and question it in terms of, is this creating a thriving life for everyone?
I was wondering about the South. We've had this reverse migration going on for the last 20 or 30 years. And I'm wondering if there were any changes in policies that enabled that, or how that's going down there. Like when I go a lot to Winston-Salem, I have a friend who lives down there, and it seems actually more integrated there than it does in the North to me.
Yeah. There's a saying I heard that this concept of race relations that is played out in the South, they don't care how close you get as long as you don't get too high. And in the North, they don't care how high you get as long as you don't get too close. And that's pretty much how it's playing out.
wow.
I stayed also in Savannah at a black-owned B&B, and the woman there had been in the Northeast for many, many years. She had been in banking or something, and she, so I asked her what it was like to move back down south, and she said, well, at least here you know who you have to stay away from. So, but I didn't know whether there was any, any of the laws had changed, any of the lending laws, any of the policies had changed down there that helped that reverse migration happen to the degree that it has been happening.
Well, I'll say that there have been changes. There have been changes. In fact, the economic basis of the South has changed. At one time, the South was primarily agricultural, and people, made their money from farming, and the use of Africans as labor for plantations was based on the, material basis of the economy. So the economies have changed. And, that made some changes. Also, the relative resources held by folk who may have, lived in the North and accumulated some resources going back to the South, they're relatively better off. However, many of the, if not the same, similar problems exist. And it still centers around this idea of, as we have our people ask questions and make comments, this idea that there's something called white people and black people. I mean, that the human family is divided out into these groups based on melanin content. And so that is still a part of the challenge. It's like what the Brookings Institute said. It's like, oh yeah, some people of African descent, they have homes, but even those homeowners, the value of their assets comparable to assets in another community are valued as less.
If you want to see an object lesson in how quickly dehumanization can happen, all we have to do is look at the southern border and what the administration is doing to the refugees.
Yeah, or look at the police shootings and killings,
But I mean, how quickly it can.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I'm curious about this term reparations. So my question for you, Willard, is that while we're waiting patiently for financial reparations to happen, is there a way in which we can conduct ourselves that is a meaningful kind of reparations? One thing for me is truth-telling, experiencing that truth in the way in which I interact with people who take the tour on Black Heritage Trail, and helping people to admire the ancestry of African Americans who have been here and are role models, not just for Black children and Black grown-ups, but for white people as well, for people of all backgrounds and ethnicities, I guess is the closest I can come to not making this a racial kind of question. What can you imagine would be a way in which for us to act in appreciation of reparations that we can do on a more personal level than we can expect from a government level?
Well, I would say that, I would turn to a comment made by this fellow Marshall Gans a couple of years ago, who said that charity asks, "What's wrong? How can I help?" Justice asks, "Why is it this way? What can I do about it?" And so part of the challenge as we talk about repairing society, not only do we have to deal with just the injuries to individuals, and some of that individual stuff needs to happen within communities, in terms of community healing, but also it may involve resources, but there are institutions that perpetuate and enable the continuing, vestiges of this marginalization to happen. So part of what I think that we have to do as a human family is deal with reconstructing those institutions. Not just telling, we got to do more than what Amilcar Cabral talked about is like, talk about ideas or give people thoughts in their head like, oh yeah, I think that's really wonderful. We got to deal with the basis of, our life, which is material benefits in these institutions, policies and practices that produce these results. All of that, one of the things that I was telling Megan that a couple of years ago, I read this book called Pagans in the Promised Land, where they really talk about the doctrine of discovery and Europeans as they left Europe and spread around the world and that impact. And our presentations have similar alignments because we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about this cultural orientation that, was imposed on the rest of the world. So, so while, I think you're asking for something, one of the things that can happen, there was a piece of legislation that I think it's now federal legislation in the House of Representatives called H.R. 40. It was an act to study the impact of the African chattel enslavement system on people of African descent today, And that is something that folk can ask their congressperson to support.
Could I say something about when you talked about Paul and Denise, like indigenous communities talk a lot about intergenerational trauma, and there's been some, and I thought about that a lot with what the chattel slavery, it's like that intergenerational trauma that's carried, and when you, there's been some amazing work in like epigenetics, and it like literally shows that the trauma that a mother or a grandmother experienced is passed on. So this idea that especially indigenous people have been saying for a long time of this intergenerational trauma is with us, and we can't, is actually like scientifically, there's been some amazing work on epigenetics showing that's actually true. Like, so that just with that trauma, yeah.
I haven't been able to hear everything that's been said, so I hope I don't break the rhythm. This is about reparations. Yes. And something that actually Angela Matthews, one of our tour guides over there, has been working on, which is the historic house museums. Are very proud of their history, and we are too. But where did that wealth come from? It would be nice if they just had something on their house or in their story to say, to acknowledge where they got their wealth. One way it can be done, which is very simple, is we have a little handout, bi-weekly magazine, the New Hampshire Gazette. The owner of that paper, the New Hampshire Gazette, for those who don't know, was New Hampshire's very first paper, goes back to colonial times, was owned by the Fowler. This is what it looks like these days. You can pick it up for free around town, and it's a wonderful read. The gentleman who now owns and publishes this paper is a descendant of the original owner. The original paper, the pressman was an enslaved man named Primus, owned by the owner of the paper. So the current owner of the paper wanted to know how he could acknowledge Primus, but he didn't want to use the name Fowler because that probably was not Primus's real name. That's just happened to be the family who bought him. So he thought about it and thought about it, and finally he decided what to do. So if you look at this paper now on the masthead, you will see an acknowledgement to Primus X.
Thank you.
When you spoke of reconstructing institutions, that reparations is more than just financial settling. In some ways, the push to integrate public education was a reconstruction kind of act. Would you favor, and there are democracies in the world that do this, to have quotas in our elected bodies that 50% of U.S. congresspersons be female or black or of other races than white men? Well, I guess they're not really a race. Whites. And I think it is done, I think it might be done in India, where there's quotas on gender at least. And in a way, that is an attempt to reconstruct an institution. Is that the only way we can move toward reconstructing institutions?
I would say that, I would say no. I would say one, no, it's not the only way. And I would say that it's probably not the best way, because really what we're doing in setting up quotas, and it's experienced as an act of charity. You're saying, oh, well, we want to bring in 50% and we just want to bring in 50%, rather than, oh, 50% of the group is this particular group and they're there because they're the best. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, there is it's difficult to imagine, for many of us, to imagine a time when we didn't view ourselves using this racial category. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, it's difficult for us to sort of imagine a time when we were, when there wasn't this hierarchy in place. And unless we deal with that part, unless we deal with that part of the healing of the human family, that's not to say everybody's the same. Everybody's different, but everybody's different. You know, there is no basis for assuming that me and the guy who's the cameraman back there, because we're both melanin enhanced, have more in common than me and the gentleman sitting here in the ochre sweater, orange sweater, because he's melanin deficient. There's no basis for it. And so unless we deal with the reality that race is made up and you can't make sense out of nonsense. Mm-hmm. So if we use it as a basis for how we try and, it's a misdiagnosis. So any prescription based on that is not going to treat the ailment.
What concrete steps, maybe even just one, could be done to reconstruct institutions that have been historically discriminatory, etc.?
Yeah. I'm sorry, did you have a
quick response to that specific question? The next time you go to vote, You should think about our criminal justice system. I'm sure that Pat Conway is a nice person. She's been the Rockingham County DA prosecutor for 17 years, 18 years. And maybe she's a fine person, and maybe she isn't part of the institutional oppression that so heavily comes down on people of color and immigrants these days, but maybe she is. And just think about it the next time you vote. And if it makes a change, then that institution will start to change.
One of the things that we got to look at is are things like education, educational institutions. You know, the fact that all of you are sitting here now, many of you, scholars and college graduates and all that. But I mean, many people when we raise this issue about the reality that race doesn't exist, said, yeah, but white people gotta. I mean, we can't, it's hard to move away. So one of the things that we need to do, we got to deal with the educational system. Part of what produced this thinking is connected to religion, and some of the religious theories in the past that have kind of, folded into today. And part of what has to happen is that the change we need to make and the repair that we need to bring about for reparations involves all of us. So challenge yourself to come up with what is the answer to that question. Because if there was an easy answer, we wouldn't be a question. So this is something that we got to figure out.
I'm so grateful for Valerie's information about the paper. I think, I served an institution for over 30 years, and I have no idea. This is an institution that existed since 1781, and I have no idea what the role of slavery was in this establishment, or where the Phillips family got their money when they first came. Elizabeth Phillips got it from somewhere. There must have been some type of slavery involvement in that. And I think that, I feel like I've been a deficient citizen of that institution. I think we can all go back. All of these schools around here that we're so proud of benefited from the labor of Africans. None of them, except for Brown University, because they were forced to, have acknowledged that in any way. So that's something that everyone can do. The other thing is, I think that as an organization, so I'm the president of the board of the Black Heritage Trail. We have an extraordinary executive director who not only put together this program, but every year, she puts together a wonderful schedule and great ideas, wonderfully presented. It's really, you did a nice job, Jerry Ann. And I remember you had. The thing is that, so we've made a decision as an organization that part of what we're going to do in our journey towards trying to establish a more perfect union, or trying to create the beloved community, or trying to bring about some degree of justice and deepening understanding is in this way, by presenting programs, by challenging your thinking, by trying to give you something more to learn and think about. You have to answer the question that I will ask you, is this making a difference for you? Does this make a difference? I know my expectation is that I don't have to go back and try to elevate the awareness of black people when I go home. That's something that we do quite well. We wake up in the morning, and that's how that happens in my household. But I do think that when I dream about what's going to happen to you after you've sat through one of these, I think you're going to go back and have conversations. I think you're going to tell your peers. I think you're going to talk to your co-workers and just give them a little something. And I think that maybe in a more fundamental area, and this is something I've learned, when your jokes start to change, your mind starts to change. So I don't know how your joking has changed. I don't know what you still joke about. What makes you less comfortable, causes you to be less comfortable than you did before. But you might just think about that as a barometer of your own growth and development, as a humane person in this troubled time. That's it.
I'm the Saginaw Squaw, or head female speaker for the Kawasaki Band, Independent Petticoat Abenaki people. I just wanted to reiterate education. The biggest thing we can do to help solve these problems is telling truth in education, such as Columbus Day. All right, just to throw one out there. So all I would like to say is to encourage each of you to go back, look into your own histories, look into your town histories, look into the state, into the country's origins, and speak the truth of the foundation of this land. And I think we'll all get along a lot better.
Amen.
end of this part of the program, talk to somebody next to you. And I want you to either talk about the ideas that you came in with, what you thought about the subject when you came in, and did you learn something new? What are you thinking now? And then I also want to thank our panelists for presenting for us tonight.